Hey everyone, my name is Akal, and what I want to tell you about today is Uttarashada Nakshatra. This particular nakshatra lies within Sagittarius and Capricorn, and this in a lot of ways is very formative in terms of the terms that I would use to describe the energy here. The one thing we have to look kind of, again, from this particular approach and how I'm looking at this nakshatra is that this is really a lot about the combination of energies. Now, all the nakshatras are a combination of energies, and the combination of those energies or planets essentially influence the character of this nakshatra, and of course then the character of the natives that are born within this nakshatra. So what I'm going to be throwing out here is I'm going to be essentially examining how these planetary energies intertwine in order to create the characteristics that are generalized about this nakshatra. So this nakshatra is very similar to the one that exists prior to it, and in the sense of high-mindedness, right? So high-mindedness. The previous nakshatra, Rulershada, was a bit more flamboyant. I would say a little less conservative, and I'm not saying conservative in the sense of like politically speaking. I'm simply saying conservative in the sense of a little more firm, a little more disciplined, okay? And that really has a lot to do with the fact that it's at the end of Sagittarius and it goes into Capricorn, so we're seeing an influence of Saturn here. So the Saturnian energies are contracting energies, right? So, but this nakshatra is, again, partially in Sagittarius, so we've got this tendency towards Jupiter-like qualities, which is high-mindedness. So, as I perceive it, what we have here is a magician in a way. And what do I mean by magician? I mean this ability to manifest. So, the ability to bring thoughts into material results. There's of course an unevolved aspect of this nakshatra, and all the nakshatras, in fact, have the same thing, which is like the sort of unevolved side, or the side of the person's ego, where they're ego dominated and they're focused on the material fixation. In other words, their energies are all expressing in a way in which it's about material accomplishment or achievement or focus. Now, this is always a conflict, like I said, in all the nakshatras, this conflict between the material and the spiritual. But in a lot of ways, I feel like this kind of peaks at this point. In some ways, I mean, somebody can make the argument that we're looking around Scorpios where we actually see that peak, and that could be very well true. But this one is what I'm really seeing, the sort of peak in the sense of individualistic. How do I explain this? So the individualistic action, or sort of like self-centeredness, we'll use the term self-centeredness, versus humility, which is the sort of like a humbling of the ego for the greater good, right? I'm very cautious about anything, or particularly in the realm of politics, etc., any sort of narratives or ideologies which talk about the greater good, because usually there's selfish interests that are pressing those greater goods, so or pushing that greater good along. And again, I'm not going to name any ideologies, but the individuation process in and of itself is always required. So when we're talking about humility, we're not talking about the removal of the individuation process, because the individuation process is incredibly important for this sign, as well as Rulershada existed before that, and again, for all the nakshatras in general. The individuation process, what it does is it allows you a separation from the ego so that you can align the ego with the soul. And once you align the ego with the soul, you can kind of, again, that sort of humbling of the ego, it allows the soul to express. But the individuation process is essential because that alignment that occurs, basically through that process, you identify your purpose. And what is purpose? Purpose is a big deal here. Again, I talked about, this energy to me in a lot of ways is this sort of, it's this energy of getting one's high-mindedness, Jupiter, bringing it down to earth into practical action. Saturn is very practical. It's disciplined, it's structured, it's traditional. I have a bunch of other words about Saturn too, but again, it's this idea of expansion, Jupiter, and narrowing it, and a bit like a funnel. That's how this energy, this nakshatra feels to me. It's the expansive energy narrowed into a funnel so that the energy can then be directed. One of the words, well, let me go ahead and read off some words for you. So this nakshatra is ruled by what is called Vishvadevas, the 10 Vishvadevas. Now I was like, oh, hey, this nakshatra has 10 gods. That's too much to memorize. Well, I'm not going to memorize them, nor am I going to repeat all the gods, but what I will read to you are the words that are associated with these gods. So we have goodness, truth, willpower, skill, time, desire, firmness, ancestors, brightness, and peak. So some of the words that kind of jumped out at me, one was firmness, willpower, and this word peak. And I was like, why are those words jumping out at me? Well, the reason they jump out at me has to do with what is the energy that rules this nakshatra? The sun. The sun. So Uttarashada is considered the peak of the sun's expression. Just as Venus was the peak in Purvarashada, Venus, I believe, was the peak of the expression in Purvarashada, the previous nakshatra. So, but the sun being the peak expression here, well, what does that mean, right? So in a lot of ways, what that means is that this is the point at which the soul can have the greatest impact on the material or on the environment around these individuals. I like to think that Sagittarius in general, so any Sagittarians out there, if you're kind of interested in how your energy is flowing in a lot of ways, your energy, your soul is ruled by the earth. Okay, so in a lot of ways, you can kind of look at it like that. And what does that mean? That means taking high-minded principles and putting it into practical action. And this is, at this point in Uttarashada, right at the end of Sagittarius, it's at its most mature, this idea of bringing one's high-mindedness and principles and values and expressing it out onto the material for manifestation purposes. So this is the point at which it peaks, again, because this is ruled by the sun. So the sun is described by two gunas. Those two gunas are Rajasic and Sattvic, meaning, so Rajasic, the essence of the sun is Rajasic, meaning motion, action, right? So it's radiating. The sun radiates. That is an action. It is positive principle. So Sattva, though, is the kind of the end result, or how it's ultimately experienced. So that Sattvic, on the most superficial level, is experienced as bringing clarity, right? The sun has action, radiates, and then it clarifies. Okay, so that is the energy here. And so it's funny, when I was reading about this nakshatra in a few of my books, the conflict that often seems to arise from these individuals doesn't, at least this is a generalization I'm going to make. It doesn't appear that the conflict lies within oneself necessarily. It often seems like the conflict for these individuals lie in terms of how they deal with the material world or mundane circumstances. So what rises in life represents the obstacles or the challenges they have to move through. Now, why do I say this? Well, one of the reasons is that there was an animal associated with this particular energy, which is the mongoose. So the mongoose is sort of legendary in the sense that this is the animal that can take down a cobra, right? And it's not because it has poison or giant teeth or giant fangs. It's because it's wily. It has, it's perceptive, it's quick, it moves, and it can dodge and whatever else. I mean, the mongoose is able to, like I said, it can take down a snake. It's pretty impressive. So, and now another reason why the snake is kind of interesting to kind of bring up is that the nakshatra that is opposite to this on the other side of the zodiac is Ashlesha, which is ruled by the Nagas, which are snakes. So I thought, the ancients who put all this together, anyway, very interesting that they chose the mongoose to rule this particular energy. So because if you look at Ashlesha, and again, I use some negative words to describe Ashlesha, but I don't mean it's a difficult energy to deal with. But the energy is very much about poison, right? So it's about poison. You can think about a snake having poison, right? So it's about poisons. It's about danger. It's about deviant. If I'm remembering correctly, Ashlesha was ruled by Mercury. So Mercury will not necessarily throws out what can be discernment, but often if the individual is unconscious, it's about deception. Okay, so with Uttarashada, these the whole deceptiveness issue. It's less of it's again we're dealing with the opposite here. So what we may see here is very blunt and direct potentially, right? So, but the thing, one of the things that also kind of like going back to that is being that the mongoose is like it has its ability to sort of deal with dangers and to deal with dangers very, very well. It tends to give the energy here that Uttara at least implies the energy here that Uttarashada will go forward always and attack life, so to speak. This representation of an elephant tusk with Uttarashada also kind of expresses this attacking notion. A tusk is the sort of the defensive part of the elephant's anatomy, right? So the tusk defends the animal, and it's also the tusks are kind of. I guess this may not be true. Like I was reading about this, but the tusks are much more profound or pronounced on the individuals that tend to lead the herd, right? So the king of the elephants has the most glorious tusks. So that sort of kingship here is exalted, right? So this idea, and I believe also there's another interesting reference I was reading, which is that I believe it was the left tusk on an elephant was representative of Purvarashada, and it was less developed than the right tusk, which was Uttarashada. And so in other words, the left tusk was smaller than the right tusk, and the right tusk is Uttarashada. So, and again, we can look at the rulerships here. So Venus ruled, essentially ruled, Purvarashada, and Venus is desire. It's magnetism, it's desire, it's those sorts of energies, which are always ultimately kind of like lesser qualities relative to the sun. The sun's kind of what runs everything in a lot of ways, right? So now we're getting that energy to being completely exalted here. So, other words, I think in the end, you kind of have to look at this energy here as having a great deal of responsibility. The responsibility with Uttarashada is to make sure they find that humility. The ego has to be humbled, and it's going to be humbled through life circumstance. It's going to be humbled through the process of the individual needing to honor, because a lot of the impulsiveness, the flamboyance, the gregariousness is sort of ironed out a bit here. And then what I mean by that is that gregarious energy that we saw in Purvarashada is ironed out here, becomes a little more firm. And then we're talking about the application of will, the sun. So that application of willpower, that drive, it becomes much more sort of contemplative, and that energy, that contemplative energy, that penetrating mind, elephant tusk, that penetrating mind here is really about penetrating into the observation of oneself in terms of how am I being guided here? How is my intuition and my instincts, how are they guiding me to move outward into the material plane? What actions do I need to take in order to exalt my energies. My energies can be exalted here, and sort of to bring the highest aspect into everyday life, my highest expression into everyday life. So some of the other planets involved here, I know you can't see here, but I have my little diagram there. So the sun, like I said, is what rules Uttarashada, and it's Jupiter and Saturn. I have this light here. It's from my spotlight anyway. I think it looks appropriate. It kind of looks like another sun there. So anyway, but it's covering up the Saturn, just so you know. Now, the other planetary energies involved here are more Jupiter and Saturn. So now what does that mean? So usually when I see this kind of lineup, so Jupiter and Saturn are the further out personal planets, meaning that there's a slower operation here, meaning that the evolutionary pattern over the course of the life path of the individual is drawn out over time. And what how this kind of expresses is, I tend to think of like in the pattern here is Jupiter, Saturn, Saturn, Jupiter. Okay, the 4 padas, and all 4 of these padas represent Uttarashada in general. And the first Jupiter I tend to think about as being the sort of the Sagittarius rulership of Jupiter, right? So that is the Sagittarian energy, that sort of high-minded energy, which at times can be hypocritical. So in the first pada with Uttarashada here, we're getting a lot of high-mindedness. And I wrote down confidence and righteousness. Okay, so anyone who knows a lot of Sagittarian folks, and because again, this first pada falls within Sagittarius, so we're looking at a lot of Jupiter here. So it's a lot of Jupiter energy. So very expansive energy, very high-minded, but righteousness, that's not always a word I tend to associate in a positive way. Oftentimes it is, but righteousness, people who believe horrible things can be righteous, right? So this is where I believe any individual, particularly if you're born in that first pada, you got to be very clear about what it is that you're so confident about and what it is you're righteous about. And are those self-serving, or have you humbled your ego? Are you honoring your soul and ultimately your role within the totality, within the collective? So that's a big deal here. And but within that first pada, like I said, it's a lot of positive energy, a lot of radiant, expansive, it's beautiful energy. So, but that's the first pada. Again, lots of high-mindedness, potential religiosity, et cetera, but you got to make sure that all that expansiveness, that righteousness is grounded, and again, honoring the soul. So the second pada is Saturn. So now we're getting a contraction here. We're going to see here let's put it this way. It says thoughts into material, right? So this is the point at which all that sort of expansive, highly principled energy that Jupiter brings about is contracted down and funneled out onto the material. So in the second pada, that is the energy that represents this quality in Uttarashada. So really here, this is kind of, as I see it, this is sort of the peak point of physical manifestation. So what you might get here again, if the individual is not evolved, if they're operating egoically, you're going to get a certain amount of like really wanting to attach to material things. Again, this is more Capricorn kind of Saturn here. So it's in a lot of ways, this is about reimagining the box. So as the individual connects to their soul, what they're doing in a lot of ways, they're using all this high-mindedness to reimagine the box. Now, what is the box? The box is the sort of structure. What's Capricorn represent? It represents structures which we use to organize and govern ourselves, right? So you can talk about government structures and, anyway, all sorts of other kinds of structures and the ways in which we socially organize. And so what you might see here is sort of like a revolutionary character in terms of like taking those high-minded energies and bringing it back down at the material and being able to see how things need to be reimagined, okay? So that can materialize a great deal in this particular pada. So the third pada, again, we got Saturn, but we're talking about Aquarian kind of Saturn here. So we're going to have more of that continuation of that theme of sort of reimagining how Saturn sort of expresses out in the material world, right? Because Saturn ultimately is what rules the material plane. It's the energy that kind of, I'd like to think about it as like gravity. So it is the energy that keeps us anchored into the planet, right? So I wrote underneath there, I wrote teamwork, I wrote accumulation of material or knowledge, okay? So it's accumulation of material or knowledge. And I think the accumulation of either one of those things really depends on, well, again, it depends on the individual and where they are in their evolutionary process. I could see, and again, if we're talking about the accumulation of material versus knowledge, what I might say theoretically would be that, again, if the individual here has tremendous, it's a lot of energy. Again, I always have to come back to this. There's a lot of energy to sort of put out into the world with this. Always keeping in mind it's ruled by the sun, which is radiating, right? So, and there's also a deep sort of instinctual kind of energy here that's like connected to its ancestors, right? So this idea of ancestors reminds me of Magha Nakshatra, which was this instinctual drive out into the material plane where that sun just radiates, just goes out into the material plane. So you get all these like kingly like descriptions and things like that. Well, monarchs inherit their fortunes, right? So, but again, what you're getting with Uttarashada is also very similar energy, this sort of expansive, shining principle to go out into achievement and to sort of get those material things. But the accumulation of material things gets stupid after a while, right? So eventually, maybe, and actually the accumulation of knowledge becomes stupid as well. So with the third pada, you're going to have a lot of drive to sort of accumulate either material things or knowledge. But again, you got to watch it in the sense of what is all the point of all the accumulation unless you're doing something with it. Now, what are you doing with it? Well, you're here to serve, right? Ultimately, the highest expression of Uttarashada is humility. So you're here to serve. You're here to bring higher principles and express it out in the material plane. Fourth pada, Jupiter, but now we're talking Pisces. So Pisces, this implies, well, you're getting the mutability of Pisces here. So this is, again, Jupiter in as it relates to Sagittarius is so very different than Jupiter as it relates to Pisces, in my opinion. The Jupiter as it relates to Pisces is very much, it's always got this like principle of, how do I explain it? It's the ultimate humbling of the ego, right? So the ultimate humbling of the ego. So as I've known a lot of Piscean folks, one of the things that I've always kind of noticed is that there's this deep desire to serve. So that ultimately leads to this sort of just total destruction of the ego. So that's one of the reasons on some level that in Uttarashada, when I say humility is being its highest expression, it really has to do with this fourth pada and the energies that exist in this fourth pada, where it is about service, still very much about service, but the service now is not just about serving humanity necessarily, but the absolute highest principles of how to connect humanity to God. So what you might get with this particular pada is someone who might be deeply spiritual, deeply spiritual. And again, I know it falls into Capricorn, so you're getting that sort of Saturnian practical functional energy. But yes, it is someone who might be deeply humbled, deeply spiritual, and so everything they're going to do is going to have a deeply spiritual principle. But they're going to have to go through the sort of internal struggle, the internal kind of combat to find that balance between the sort of spiritual and material in order to achieve that expression. So I think that's all I want to say about this nakshatra. I've talked quite long enough. So with all that said, hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and thank you.